In this, the ninth in our series of My Stories, we're going to be talking to Dr. Gillian Ingram as she discusses how medicine and God's direct intervention in healing go together. She makes the point in her own inimitable way that the mechanism that makes medicine work points to God, and that as we understand medicine far more and the workings of the human body, rather than take us away from God, it points us more to the Creator, the one who made the mechanism work in the first place. I think you're going to find it really interesting as she tells her own personal outlook and her own personal perspective on this subject as she works it out in practice as a consultant doctor in the context of a hospital. We hope you're going to find it helpful and interesting. Thanks for watching. Well, I'm here with Gillian, and we are going to be talking about healing. And one of the reasons why I'm really interested in talking to Gillian about it is because she's a doctor and therefore has a vested interest in the whole subject of medicine and healing. And it came out of a conversation that we had a few weeks ago that I found really interesting, and I thought that you might find it interesting too. So for the benefit of those who don't know Gillian, I'm going to get her to introduce herself and tell us her job title and what she does, etc., etc. So welcome, really nice to have you with us.
Thank you. So I'm Gillian. I'm a consultant neurologist. I work at Morriston Hospital in Swansea. So I look after a lot of patients with neurological disorders. So that might be headache or epilepsy or Parkinson's. But most of my work I do is actually looking after people with multiple sclerosis. That's what I do most of my time.
Okay, and that's a neurologist, not a urologist.
Yes, yes, can be, the cause of confusion at 3 a.m. phone calls. But
somebody said to me a couple of weeks ago, "Oh, she's a urologist." I went, "No, wrong part of the anatomy." So there we go.
yeah,
But
all brains.
yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that really sort of intrigued me when we had that conversation was the fact that I asked you a question, and that's how do you reconcile your faith, the fact that you're a Christian, with the whole area of your professional background and life. And you went, "Oh, it's really easy." So tell us, well, seek to answer that question for me, and tell us why it's really easy.
Oh, I'm not sure I said really easy. I don't I don't think these things are ever really easy, are they? But I mean, I guess how do I reconcile my profession and my faith together? I see these things as running in parallel rather than being discordant. And I think we were discussing the fact that there's bits of medicine that we understand now and that we can control. So that might be people that I see who have some inflammation in their eye and go suddenly blind, and I can treat them with steroids and it comes back. And I think, if that had happened 200 years ago, people would have thought that was absolutely miraculous. And it still is miraculous.
Yeah.
Just because we understand how that happens doesn't really take the miracle out of it. So I was saying I see God working in people that I work with as a medical profession quite frequently. And sometimes I've got a really good understanding of how that has worked on a biological basis. And sometimes I don't understand it at all. I had a lady come and see me for something completely different related to her health. And we were talking and she was telling me that her husband had had a terminal cancer, and he was in a hospice with extensive metastases, and he was put on a syringe pump and told to go home with palliative care at home and expect to die within 48 hours. And he was a pastor of one of the churches up in the valleys, and they were all praying for him. And that was 5 years ago, and he's done very well. And he wondered if it was the CBD capsules that he was taking. And I said, I don't think CBD capsules work like that. I think it was probably the prayer.
Okay.
He agreed with.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
there's situations like that you can't explain the miracle. which doesn't mean that we won't be able to explain it in future.
So that seems to suggest that God is a God of the gaps, that God is our explanation when we don't have any rational explanation at the moment, and when we do have a rational explanation, then God will once again be edged out of the scenario. I'm guessing that's not what you're saying.
No, I don't think so at all, Richard. I mean, if you look at the beginnings of the Bible, where, God said he made the world with a snap of his fingers in 6 days, and we now have a really good understanding of evolution and the way that these things work. It doesn't take away from the creation story just because we understand that the world isn't flat and, was made over thousands and thousands of years. So I think, we shouldn't take away from God just because we've got some understanding. We should just kind of revel in the fact that the beauty of those mysteries being made clear to us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's interesting because I've just had a cataract operation, and I say obviously, but maybe it isn't obvious. But and I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the eye. I mean, the eye is extraordinary. And compared to the brain, it's sort of also ran, but and I was thinking about cameras. In order to do automatic, focus on a camera is hugely complex, whereas the brain and the eye do it in a blink, less than a blink of an eye. And when your eyes are absolutely right and you don't need glasses, you can look out into the long distance, and then you can look at something in terms of reading, and your eyes never go out of focus. That's extraordinary. Now, you look at a camera and you look at the lens with all the glass pieces in it and all the electronics in it, and you go, wow, somebody made that. You look at the eye and go, oh, well, of course, And I find that really slightly bizarre, but...
Yeah, it's incredible. And there's hundreds of examples about that within the brain. And it's probably one of the reasons I was interested in going into neurology, is because there's so many areas and so many things about the brain that we don't understand. That's fascinating. But we do have a lot more grasp of some things. So, for example, I've seen plenty of people who've gone suddenly blind with no explanation, with a flash of light. And then 3 days later, it comes back to normal. And I understand for them why that's happened. But when it happened to Saul in the Bible, we like to register that as a miracle. And it was a miracle, but it doesn't mean there wasn't a biological basis to it.
Okay.
And now we've got
really
a lot of understanding of the biological basis of things, which is really good. But there's plenty of things that I still don't understand. And which it's still fascinating, and I expect we will have an understanding of these in the future.
Yeah. When we had the conversation last time, we talked about the impact of psychology, the impact of, the way we think, and how it manifests in terms of our physiology, how we are physically. And you used a couple of illustrations that I found really interesting, because they sort of connected the need to reconcile oneself emotionally with the rectification of what it was that was manifesting itself on, physically. And unpack that a bit for me. You said the brain is an amazing thing in terms of its power to have influence, well, literally to have influence over absolutely everything that we do. Talk about that just a bit.
Yeah, it's a really complex part of neurology, actually, that we're beginning to understand a little bit more of, but there's still a lot of mysteries, and that's that of functional disorders. So the power of the brain to control your eyes, your limbs, and everything. And there's some people who lose control of it. So there's no reason that their legs can't have power, or they can't feel their legs. All of the nerves work completely fine, the brain works fine. But for some reason, those messages aren't getting through. There's a disconnect. And they have, I've seen patients who have complete weakness and are unable to walk because of a functional disorder. So this disconnect between the brain and the limbs, and the brain literally just telling the limbs not to move, so mistaking those messages. And it's a really difficult disorder to understand, because there's definite chemical changes in the brain which you can see on functional MRI images, but we still don't really understand the exact mechanism behind it. But what we do understand is that people can relearn these skills. So with psychological therapies, they can relearn and relearn to walk, really, and not because their nerves are regrowing or there's, you know, organic changes, but because they're relearning these actions. And there's a big overlap there with psychological problems. So not all of the patients, but some of them, or there is quite a lot of them do have psychological problems which are interfacing or interplaying and how and stopping them controlling their limbs, or, you know, whatever it is.
Okay.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of patients with these problems, and sometimes, and quite often, they are triggered by something that they're coming to terms with. I can't remember what examples I gave you a few weeks ago.
I can't remember the examples either, but yeah, absolutely. So in terms of you as a Christian, you know, taking your faith to work, you know, and working it out in that context, how does that play out? I mean, obviously there is profound mystery in terms of the function of the brain, let alone, you know, faith and, you know, and all of that. But how does it work out for you? You know, how do you take your faith to work?
It is really difficult, because I think there is a degree of professionalism in that I've got to respect my patients and their beliefs, and whether they've got no beliefs or whether they've got different beliefs.
Yeah.
My job is to respect their views and not impose my views on them. But when I became a doctor, I had a deep sense of calling, that God was asking me to become a doctor so that he could work through me to help other people. And so this is the thing, isn't it? We pray for people for miracles, for God to work like that, but actually God often works through
absolutely.
doctors and through the medical profession, which I think is why God's giving us a greater understanding of all of these problems, so that we can work miracles on his behalf, almost, so that he can work through us. So yeah, I think when I was called to be a doctor, that was my sense. I was being asked to help people through the skills that God's given me over the years. And some of what I do is medicine and giving drugs and diagnosing people. And a lot of what I do on a day-to-day basis is sitting down and listening to people and almost coaching, like talking about life skills, or just listening to them. And I think that's some of the biggest part of the healing process, is being listened to and understood and accepted, especially with the functional neurological disorders that I was talking about. Actually hearing what the patient says and understanding and empathizing with them is a really big part of their healing process.
Okay, now let's flip the coin. You're taking your work to church. So you're not taking your faith to work, you're taking your work to church. Because how does that play out? I mean, I recognize that when you are in church, you're on my turf, really. Like, if I went to the hospital, I'd be on your turf. And in my world, I can say very definitely things that I wouldn't ever dream of saying if I was in the hospital, because it's not my context, and it's not appropriate to say certain things. How do you do that? I mean, you come to church, you lead the worship group, you listen to me drone on about God being able to intervene, etc., etc. How do you deal with that? How does it work out for you?
I don't know. I mean, I do compartmentalize a little bit.
Right. Okay.
So, and I think we all have to do that a bit. You have your work yourself, your mum's self, and and so there is a little bit of that goes on, I must say.
It's when they all squeeze all together, don't they? Then you suddenly find yourself sort of extruded into a very strange shape.
Yeah. And if you ask me, do I feel an increased call to pray for people for healing at church? Sometimes, but maybe not more than anyone else.
Yeah.
I don't know. I that's the kind of work part of things, but sometimes I do.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's
I'm with.
interesting. I was talking to another doctor on Monday, and they were saying a very similar thing. They were saying, because I was asking them, how do you preserve your convictions, your faith convictions, in the face of, Western scientific rationalism, red in tooth and claw, as it often is in the context that you're working in. And they said, when I walk out of the house, I walk into that arena. And when I walk back into the house, and I suppose they're saying the same thing, aren't they? They're sort of preserving their convictions, their passions, their beliefs by compartmentalizing in order to be able to do that.
Yeah. So I do compartmentalize a little bit, but I also go back of the black and white of the beginning. I do not see that science and faith are
Okay.
two separate
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And the thing, sometimes it annoys me a little bit when people do say, oh, well, you're a Christian, therefore you can't believe in Darwinism or whatever.
Yeah.
Of
Yeah.
course you can. There's, some of our greatest scientists were Christians when we go back through
Absolutely.
the ages. And they understood that this is just an explanation of God working. So in that way, it does blend really well. It's
Yeah.
just, you've got to, I think sometimes we reduce God by
Yes.
not accepting that he's giving us more understanding as we grow.
Mm.
Gosh, if he'd have tried to explain evolution to the early Christians when they were writing the Bible, I think they'd have blown their minds, wouldn't they?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because take for example, the fact that the universe is finite, and the universe had, for many, many years, science would say that the universe had no beginning and no end. It was infinite. And the Bible always said, of course, no, that's not the case. It had a beginning and it will have an end. And it's only in the last sort of 50 years or so, 60 years, that science has caught up in a way and gone, oh, okay, hang on a minute, our explanation was wrong. And the Bible actually proves to be correct. And that's quite interesting. I mean, I always find it interesting from both perspectives. When the Bible, you get evolution and it gives an explanation and fills in what the Bible doesn't actually really describe, because it doesn't give us a lot of detail in Genesis, nor does it intend to, simply because it's not about how things started and the workings of that. It's about how we got ourselves in the mess we're in.
Yeah.
So I find that really quite interesting, in terms of. But I read a book. I read a book years and years ago, and it was called All Truth is God's Truth. That God is not the God of the gaps. That all truth, no matter how it's discovered, is actually just an explanation of the way that God made things and how it works. And I've always found that really helpful. Really helpful.
Yeah, and I think it is important for everyone to keep quite humble, actually, because I think even
Right.
the greatest physicists, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. It's scientists who think that we've discovered everything and we know, they're definitely right, to just a little bit ignorant, really. I mean, clearly we don't understand everything.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Hey, that's really interesting, and really appreciate you giving me the time to do that, because I know how incredibly busy you are most of the time. I just, I don't know how you manage to put it all together, to be honest with you, most of the time. So thank you so much.
That's all right. Nice to speak to you.